passionate, driven, enthusiastic, euphoric. This is who we are as entrepreneurs. But how we leverage these incredible attributes to dream and build businesses that scale and grow is what this podcast is all about. Hello, I'm attorneypreneur Josh Brown, and welcome to Franchise Euphoria. Hello, everyone. Thrilled to be back for another episode of Franchise Euphoria, and really looking forward to this episode. We're going to talk about how much does it cost to turn a business into a franchise. Boy, oh boy, this is a question that I get a lot. It seems to be on a lot of business owners' minds. I'm not sure if it's because of all the franchise stuff in the news with McDonald's or with all this stuff going on out in Seattle and California having to do with the minimum wage debate. And not to get on too much of a tangent here, but some of this stuff is just kind of crazy to me. I don't know if y'all are paying too close attention to it, but there's some ordinances and some laws that are being considered out in Seattle and California where they're going to look at raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And whether that's good or bad, I'm not here to comment on that. But what I do think is crazy is that some of these ordinances are excluding franchisees because they're saying that they're not really a small business. So there's this part of the ordinance is basically saying that if you're a business of 500 or more employees, that the minimum wage increase goes into effect immediately. But if you're smaller than that, which would be classified as a small business according to the U.S. Census Bureau. I mean, I just can't believe that. If you 500 or less is considered 500 employees or less is considered a small business by the U.S. Census Bureau. But that's a whole nother discussion. But the point is, what they've said is if you're a small business, you don't have to phase in the minimum wage increase until 7 years later. But some of these ordinances have a specific exclusion for franchisees. I mean, that is crazy. Essentially what they're saying is that because franchisees are part of a larger franchise system, they're really not a small business, especially the ones that have many locations. And so that minimum wage increase, in theory, would apply to franchisee owner-operators right away as opposed to being phased in over time. Well, I don't know what everybody thinks about that, but I can tell you my opinion is that is crazy. Franchisee owner-operators are small business owners, just like mom and pop shops, just like independent businesses. And just because they're part of a larger system doesn't mean that they aren't operating a small business, doesn't mean that they have the challenges that other small businesses have. And most of them, it's the owner and a few employees, a classic small business. It's not an employer-employee relationship under the traditional realm of franchising. When you buy a franchise, the franchisee owner-operator is not an employee of the franchisor system. I know there's been instances where there's been so much control by the franchisor that the courts have interpreted that as such, but the classic definition of a franchise is it's an independent relationship. I mean, you're paying money to utilize somebody else's brand to sell their goods and services in exchange for a fee and a royalty and the opportunity to utilize their marketing and operations plan. But it's your business. It's not an employer-employee situation. So sorry to go off on that tangent here, but I've just been reading a lot about this whole situation, and I just think a lot of this stuff is just getting kind of crazy out there, but I guess that's a discussion for another day. Today, we're going to talk about how much does it cost to turn a business into a franchise. Well, as you can imagine, I have a lot of thoughts on that. And, there's really not one answer. I mean, if we look at franchising, most people, when they think of a franchise, think of a traditional kind of business franchise, which would be, you go buy a McDonald's, you go buy a restaurant, you buy a Subway, whatever the case may be. Would be more of a business format franchise where you're buying one individual unit, or possibly looking at adding other units down the road, but you're incrementally increasing the number of franchise units that you have. Well, that would be setting yourself up as a single franchise operator. But there's also multi-unit operators. There's also area development agreements. There's master franchising. I mean, there's a lot of different aspects of franchising that most people don't know about, but it's something that when you're considering turning your business into a franchise, you really need to think about and consider, what kind of franchise do you want to be? So if you decide that you want to set your business up so that you're just selling individual franchise units, and maybe you sell on a multi-unit deal if the situation warrants, that's going to be there's going to be different things to consider when you set that up versus when you decide that the way that you want to franchise your business is you want to set it up through area developer agreements, which is essentially when you sell usually one location in a particular state to somebody who becomes the franchisee, but then they also become the area developer for that entire state. And then they're charged with the responsibility, which is dictated by a contractual time frame, where they then have to go, and it's in part their responsibility to develop the rest of the state in however many territories have been broken out through a state. And of course, they get paid a part of the franchise fee when they do find somebody, and they usually get paid a percentage of the continuing royalty. It's kind of like a multi-level marketing kind of system. Some people think it's more like a pyramid scheme. I think when it's done the right way, it's not, but I certainly understand the analysis. But the point of me explaining all that is, that's really just one of the things you have to consider when you're thinking about turning your business into a franchise. And if anything I just said over the last couple minutes, you sort of go, wow, I just didn't know about any of that, then you are not unlike most people out there who think about franchising in a very narrow way. And what I would say is the vast majority of businesses that think that they want to franchise simply should not franchise. So whenever I'm talking to a business owner and we're talking about the franchise opportunity, it's super important to figure out where they are in their business. I mean, if you are operating a business and you don't have multiple locations, if you're a brick and mortar type business and you don't already have multiple locations up and running, I strongly suggest that you get those up and running before you ever consider franchising. I mean, it is very, very different going from running one business to now running two businesses, especially when they're location dependent. So a lot of people find, and they underestimate how important it is for them to be at a location for it to be successful, and how reliant the business is on them until they expand to a second location. Because as much as technology has improved a lot of things and we can be more efficient, we can do a lot of stuff. Last time I checked, as a person, you can only be in one place at one time. And so I think it's really instructive, and I think it's instrumental for a business to really know what it's like to operate multiple locations before they franchise. Now, if you're the type of business where it doesn't require a brick and mortar location, if possibly you're a business where you currently have licensees that are already in place, maybe you have a system that you've been licensing and now you want to convert that over to a franchise system, well, that's a very different equation than the one I just talked about. I mean, that might require less work. You've already got the pieces in place for the licensing system. Now it's about converting licensees over. It's about creating the documentation that is necessary, going through the proper registrations, and then figuring out through an operations manual how the system is going to grow. So ideally, I think the best way for me to explain how much it costs to turn your business into a franchise is for me to just kind of break down the process for you. So at least when somebody comes to me and they approach me and ask about turning their business into a franchise, the very first thing that I try to do is I want to get a very clear picture of where that business is, not just location wise, but where they are in terms of how long have they been in operation, how many locations do they have, are they properly set up, are they properly registered through the state as a business, do they have their trademark and registrations properly filed with the United States Patent and Trademark Office, what are those registrations? Have they been approved, or are they still in the application process? Is there other intellectual property considerations to be thinking about in terms of the business? As an example, if you're a business and you sell products, maybe it's a proprietary type product that you created. Have you properly protected that? In other words, I'm looking to see if the business, what kind of foundation the business has set up to that point. And what I often find is that they have some things, but they don't have other things. So the very first thing that I try to do is to make that foundation solid, because you can't build a franchise off of a cracked foundation. Just like you can't build any business off of a cracked foundation, you need to make sure that you've got a solid base. You've got a solid foundation from which you can then grow through a franchising process. So the very first thing that I do, again, is figure out where they are from the perspective of, do they have their ducks in a row legally from an accounting perspective? What kind of insurance do they have? Are their products adequately protected? Looking at the business really in full picture. I want to get a very, very clear picture of where they are and figure out what they are missing and try to help them plug those holes. Once we've done that, and through the course of doing that, you usually have a discussion about where the entrepreneur, where the business owner sees the business going. I mean, this is a fascinating discussion that is usually had because, I really want to know what's the goal of the entrepreneur. Some people want to grow their business fast and furiously and want to go international. Others want to be slow and deliberate and be more organic with the process. And quite frankly, the latter is who I usually end up working with because that's just, I think that's the better way to go in most cases. But I want to find out exactly what the entrepreneur has in mind, because it can be very different from what he or she had in mind when they started the business. The other thing I really want to find out is what the entrepreneur or business owner loves to do with the business. What are the roles? What is the role or the roles that the entrepreneur likes to play in their business? And the reason that this is so important is because when you franchise your business, that fundamentally changes your role as an owner. No longer are you now concerned with just one location. You now have to be concerned with the overall system. And it really, really changes in a lot of ways what kind of role the entrepreneur business owner is going to take in the growing system. And to some extent, you have control over that and you can dictate that. But I think a lot of times people don't necessarily consider that before they decide that they want to grow through franchising. So I really want to get a very, very clear picture of what that is that they want to do. After that, we have the discussion, as I alluded to early on in this episode, of, what type of franchise systems do they want? What kind of franchisees do they want? Let's get a crystal clear picture of who's going to be a good operator for your business. And I think that ties directly into your operations plan. Every single business, whether you're franchised or not, needs to have an operations manual. Now, there are different types of manuals. When you put together a franchise operations manual, that is much more substantial than just a regular small business operations manual. You're dealing with different considerations. The operations manual essentially becomes the Bible for the franchisee owner operator. It becomes that documented resource that they go to a lot, usually as they're within the first year or two of operation, to see the protocol of the company, to go to answer questions, to go to just see what, go to see and learn about things that will most certainly come up through the course of franchise ownership. So I like to figure out how much of the knowledge with the entrepreneur is stuck in the entrepreneur's head and how much is already down on paper. Usually it's all stuck in the entrepreneur's head. And so we then want to start and go through the process of putting together an operations manual. As we're going through this process, I have franchise questionnaires that I send out regarding that ask questions about that are pertinent to the franchise agreement and to the franchise disclosure documents. Whenever you set up a franchise, you have to create what's called a franchise disclosure document that has 23 federally mandated items. You also have to, included with that franchise disclosure document are usually the franchise agreements, any kind of promissory notes that are associated with the franchise, and any other kind of documentation that would go along with the franchise purchase. This is usually a very, very involved process. And so it takes time to make sure that these documents are being put together in the right way. The franchise disclosure document essentially tells prospective buyers all about the system, all about the owners, all about the current franchisees in the system, the people who are no longer part of the system, where their locations are, how much it's going to cost to open up a location, a breakdown of the cost and fees. I mean, it really covers a lot of things. So putting together all the documentation for those agreements, for the franchise disclosure document, really takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of questioning and back and forth and listening to the entrepreneur to make sure that we have a crystal clear picture of what it is our offering is actually going to be. I think that sometimes people think that they have their business all figured out and they have it systemized and processed and they're ready to go. And then they go through this process of turning it into a franchise, and it just takes it to a whole nother level. Because at the end of the day, there are always little things that are overlooked. And there's always things that you as an entrepreneur, when you're running your business, just sort of automatically do, it becomes second nature. But these are things that have to be documented for owners that are coming in. I mean, in many cases, franchisee owner operators will not have had any experience with your type of business or will not have had any kind of business ownership experience. As I've talked about often, I mean, the best franchisees are usually exceptional managers and great operators. That does not mean that they have ever had business ownership experience. And so you have to be able to break down and explain your system through an operations manual, through a franchise disclosure document, and through any and all other communications with your franchisee so that they are able to take that and get up and running with it. So once you go through, this process is probably the longest part of the process of turning a business into a franchise. After going through that process, then it's a matter of determining, depending on which state you're in, there's various registrations. I mean, there's franchise states across the U.S. Not every state is a franchise state, but many of them, not many, it's not even a majority, it's about 15, but those states usually have specific statutes and requirements and registration requirements. There's also states that may not necessarily have franchise statutes, but they have what's called business opportunity laws, and some have exemption statutes. And so there's a lot of things to consider depending on the state that you are going to be operating your franchise in. And so when you're considering turning a business into a franchise, one of the costs that's associated with it is obviously related to, okay, what do we have to do to register this as a franchise in a particular state if that's required? What do we have to do to make sure that this is exempted if that's required? What do we have to do to make sure that we're staying within or getting around certain business opportunity laws, and making sure that we're comporting with both federal and state laws? And so that's in addition to the putting together the franchise disclosure document and the other franchise agreements. Once you've gone through that and you've completed all the documentation, you've filed the proper registrations, you've paid the filing fees, you've created the franchise disclosure documents, the franchise agreements, you've got your detailed operating plan and marketing plan, I think you really need to be thinking about, okay, once this is set up and going, what is the actual goal? I mean, how are we as a franchise now going to go out and find prospective franchisees, and not just finding anybody, but finding the right franchisees? Well, there's a lot of companies out there that can help with that. And some are good, some aren't. And in certain instances, it's necessary to bring in a third party like that. In some instances, it's not. I mean, if you've already got a system where you've got, let's say, 10, 11, 12, or numerous licensees, and we're just converting those over to franchisees, maybe you're not in a rush to add more franchisees to the system. Maybe you want to steadily maintain and grow that brand, but wait a little bit because you've already got franchisees in the system. So maybe at that point, it's not necessary to put in place a third-party vendor or company to come in and market the franchise. But in a lot of instances, it's very, very important to at least consider that. And there's a cost that's associated with that. So there are a lot of things, as you can tell, to this process of franchising. And I think sometimes that, entrepreneurs who are considering growth and thinking about growing their business, and maybe they've had people reach out to them and ask if they're interested in franchising, and maybe they don't know a lot about the process. Oftentimes, short sight, how much it's going to cost and how much time it's going to take. I would say the average time to take a business and go through the entire process and turn it into a franchise is going to take at least 6 months. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's people out there who could say it could be done faster, but I'm going to say it's going to take at least 6 months of specific, dedicated, consistent work to go through that process. So this is not something that can be done over a month's period of time. I mean, this is not something that is done certainly overnight. It's something that takes time. And, there's a reason for that. I mean, it's a big, big deal to make the decision that you're going to franchise your business. I mean, you have to make sure that you're doing it and comporting and keeping in line with federal law, state law, and also from a business perspective, you want to make sure that you're not just going to spend all this money to turn yourself into a franchise and then not have a plan for how you're going to capitalize on that in the future. There's no question that franchising in my mind, is a fantastic way to grow a business. It's a fantastic way, once you get everything set up, to have other people invest in your system and essentially use other people's capital to grow your business. And it works tremendously well when it's a win-win situation. I think, unfortunately, there's far too many systems, far too many entrepreneurs that get ahead of themselves in the process, and it can turn into a nightmare. So I just think it's really, really important. If you're a business owner out there, if maybe you've got a business that's had moderate or good success and you're considering growth opportunities, I would recommend, before you make a decision, make sure you understand everything that's going to go into the process, because it's not just the legal costs that are associated with it. And, it's just amazing to me that people just think of it from that perspective. Okay, how much is it going to cost for the attorney to file the paperwork, create the documents? That's all I need to consider. If you ask anybody in the franchise industry who's been in franchising for any period of time, any significant period of time, they will tell you that it will cost a lot more than you think up front to do it the right way. Because putting a system and fine-tuning a system to the point that it needs to be to really be of great value to a franchisee just flat takes time, and it costs money. But the idea is that if you have the growth strategy in place and you have the idea and you've thought about how you're going to recapture that investment, how long it's going to take, how much is it going to cost, how long is it going to take, and you can start putting a plan together and realize that if it's done the right way, it can be a very lucrative process. But that does not mean it does not cost a good amount of money up front. So the short answer to the question of how much does it cost to turn a business into a franchise is it depends. But I will tell you this, you're realistically going to be looking at anywhere, if you're including an operations manual, if you're including working with a potential business or trying to put in place a marketing plan for how you're going to attract more franchisees. I mean, you're certainly looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of $50,000 to $100,000, probably upwards of that to a certain extent. Again, it's very, very hard to give an exact amount. In fact, I think it's disingenuous to do that because, like I said, it just depends. There's a lot of things to consider. There's a lot of legalese. There's a lot of things that have to be put in place, and there's a lot of business decisions that just point blank take time to make. So hopefully this was instructive, educational, helpful to you if you're thinking about the process. If anything, I just really wanted to highlight by going through this process that really all the steps that are involved. And I could break down all those steps even more, but this would be a 4-hour show. And I certainly don't think you're going to be interested in that. But hopefully I've done a okay job to sort of outline what goes in to turning your business into franchise, because that's the only way to truly understand and appreciate how much it's going to cost to turn your business into a franchise. Well, until next time, I hope you dream big. I hope you are putting in place systems and procedures for your own business and really thinking about what kind of business you want to be, or perhaps if you're looking at buying a business, what kind of business you want to purchase. It is so vital to take the time on the front end, whether or not you're growing your business, whether or not you're buying your business, whether or not you're thinking about getting in as a business owner, really take the time on the front end to figure out what it is you want. You will be much happier thereafter. Until the next time, happy franchising.
Thanks for being with us today on the Franchise Euphoria podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to go to iTunes and provide a review. Also, please remember that although Josh Brown is a licensed and practicing attorney, nothing contained in this podcast should be construed as legal advice, because it is not. The information contained in this podcast is general and educational in nature, and none of it should be relied upon as legal advice. That being said, if you have questions for Josh and would like to contact him, please email him at josh@franchiseeuphoria.com. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you tune in to our next weekly episode.